Perfect. Just introduce myself. My name is Tracy McCutcheon, and as the host of Fick It's Monday, I just want to try and debunk some myths and give some practical advice and generally try to help people navigate the world of parasite management, parasites, stress use, and resistance. Tonight we're joined by Ginny Dodunski, experienced vet and program manager for Wormwise. We'll delve into the world of practical parasite management and what the feck is refugia. And if you've got any questions, pop them down and put them in the chat, and at the end of it we'll try and answer as many of them as we can. The beauty of the webinar is I don't have to explain where the bathrooms are or how to get out in case of emergency, so we can just kind of kick on. So welcome, Ginny.
Thanks for inviting me. It's nice to feel like I'm a connector between organisations like FECPAC and everybody else. It's a cool job.
Yeah. I'm going to spotlight you for everyone, if I can do that. Look at me go. Ooh, I know, that's exciting, isn't it?
Didn't even know that was the thing.
I want to thank you very much for joining us, because I know that you've been very busy of late, and well, for all of 2023, actually, haven't you? You've been flat out for most of the year. You were in the Chatham Islands recently.
I was. That was a huge privilege. I was really stoked to be invited over there. A neighbour of mine in the central North Island, Ruby Mullender, she's a consultant and a farmer, and she's got family connections over there. And since the Red Meat Profit Partnership program got up and running, she started an action network group over there, which continues. And she got some good funding for them to do some of their farm compliance, farm plan stuff. And was able to help me get over there for sort of animal health side of things, and particularly worm consultancy, but also was able to do a Chatham Islands Wormwise workshop, which was pretty cool. But yeah, the farmers over there have another whole layer of challenges on top of what Kiwi farmers have got because of that isolation.
Yeah. So do they have access to, like, is there like a resident vet that they have over there? How do they get access to?
No, there isn't a resident vet, and I just listened to.
Are you moving?
No. I just listened to Tommy, the Hazlitt stock agent, interviewed the other day, and she's from Pitt Island, and her dream was to go back to Chathams and be the vet there, and she didn't get into vet school, so now she's a stock agent, but I'm sure she'll be contributing however she can to that industry over there. But so their vets come over from Geraldine, and I think somebody goes over a certain number of times a year, and they just stack up all the work. He sets up a small animal clinic in the back of the MPI office, which it's a bit of a lab. It's a reasonable sort of a surgery, but still, hard work. And so I guess, that's one of the things of isolation, isn't it? Like, if you've got a good hunt away with a twisted stomach, like, there ain't no rushing it to the vet clinic at 7 o'clock at night, or 2 o'clock on a Saturday afternoon. It's just those sort of emergency things can't be done, which would be tough. And same for the people, if the weather's not good and stuff. So I guess it's times like that where the isolation is probably most acute. The rest of the time I really just felt like I was kind of anywhere else in rural New Zealand, just with a few differences.
Oh, cool. So to get back onto the Wormwise and the parasite management, I just wanted to start off by asking you, what are your goals? What are your ambitions as being, the head of Wormwise? What do you want to see Wormwise achieve, or what do you want to see farmers achieve? What's the big...
Yeah, well, Wormwise, a vision was set for Wormwise well before I ever became the manager, which was that internal parasites no longer pose a threat to production and welfare, I think, of stock in New Zealand, and that's a pretty big thing. And also from my perspective, I'd just like to see a lot less confusion, more aligned messages, simpler messages, and in the end, there's so much of Wormwise that's tied up with farm systems, nutrition, stocking rates, feeding animals better. And I think I said to someone the other day about Wormwise, there's another module that Beef and Lamb sometimes offer called Growing Great Lambs. And I said Wormwise is actually growing great lambs, because if we can do absolutely right by our breeding ewes and wean as big a number of heavy lambs off them as we possibly can each year, then worms just become so much less of an issue, because you don't have all these high number of lambs carried through into autumn and winter. And it's really easy for me to sit here and say that, right? But when I'm not doing Wormwise, I am doing my own private consultancy, and I'm lucky enough to work with some awesome farmers who are able to demonstrate that what I've just talked about in real life. And so, I've been there as a support to them, but I've definitely learnt as much from them as they've learnt from me, watching the progress on those farms. So I know it can be done, and it's not just on flat farms. It's this is North Island Hill Country we're talking about. It's not Cheltenham or Gore. So that attention to the management of the breeding flock and growing those young stock as fast as we can. I'm sorry, I'll get off my soapbox.
No, that's what you're here for. I have to get off mine every now and again too, because it's the same deal, especially when you've got a captive audience and they've all here to hear you. So we talk about nutrition being absolute key to pretty much everything in terms of production on farm. Like, if you feed them well, it's a really good start. Then obviously parasites after that. What would you like to see farmers doing more?
I guess that there's sort of, I've always got my sheep hat on, and I know, the farms that when I first start working with a farm, quite often when you get in there and start assessing ewe body condition, and get everybody on a level as to what's good and what needs to be lifted, it's quite frustrating to begin with, because often quite a high proportion of the flock is below par, and it can take a number of years to get that right. It's not something that happens in a couple of months. So that attention to continuing to even up and lift the condition and the robustness, I guess, of the ewe flock, it's a long-term game. But the same stuff applies with like your 100-kilo calves, and this sort of feeds into lambs. Like, the faster that you can grow them through that period of risk where they are trying to develop immunity to worms, most likely to suffer from worms, and where they're doing the most worm contamination of your pastures, the faster you can get them through that stage, then the whole thing just goes so much easier. And the best performing 100-kilo calf systems I see are really, really good at that. And when you see the difference in, calves at the end of their first year from the worst to the best, it's so stark. And lambs are the same. I mean, the best lambs had their heads cut off way back, and the worst lambs are still, trying to make it to 40 kilos in August. So and I realise there's some timing issues around that too, but that's probably, I just went all over the place with that answer. Sorry, Tracy.
That's okay. So in a nutshell, better conditioned animals, more well-fed animals is the key.
I guess the pillar is those very well-fed, robust, good condition, and genetics, breeding stock, particularly with sheep, because genetics do have a role to play there. When you've got that flock, and then it's having your young stock on the cleanest, highest quality feed that you possibly can in your system. And once you get those two things sorted, worms almost become, I'm not going to say a complete non-issue, but they're just so much less of a concern. Yeah. And I mean, I've met farmers that have been doing quite a few Wormwise workshops lately, and I've met a handful of farmers who only drench their ewe lambs 3 times, for instance. So, the fact that they can do that, they've got some stuff going on in their system that means those ewe lambs can go much, much longer between drenches than the average. I've got some thoughts about what it is on those farms, but there are people out there doing it, so it can be done.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I'm just going to grab the bull by the horns, so to speak. We've heard a lot about refugia, and I renamed refugia a long time ago as confusia, because while it's a relatively simple idea, it's not necessarily that simple in practice. Well, it can be, but you've got to have a few key factors, I guess, in place. So can you explain refugia?
Yeah, so first I'll explain it and then sort of talk about my view and background of what's happened and why people are confused. So basically refugia, explain it this way, like the extreme of no refugia would be where I've got some grass that has been in maize for several years, or maize and some other crop, and then I sow this brand new grass sward where there are literally no worms on the pasture because we've turned it over so many times and we haven't had animals grazing it for such a long time. Put that new grass in. If I put some lambs onto that grass, give them a drench the day they go on, what's the only worm that's going to form the basis of a population on that grass, right? It's one that survived your drench, so probably a resistant one. So that's the extreme of no refugia, but also, you know, in our lamb systems in summer, if we're drenching every 28 days, and I'm not saying don't drench every 28 days because in a lot of systems that is the safest thing to do, but if the life cycle of your worms is 21 days, meaning from the day that that lamb ingests a larvae off the pasture to that larvae developing through to an adult, mating with another adult and producing eggs that go out onto your grass. That's 21 days. So if we're drenching every 28, the 28 days is designed to limit pasture contamination, but it's only giving us a week in which time some worms that weren't drench survivors get to develop to maturity, mate with each other, lay eggs. And so, you know, you can see how 7 days isn't actually that long when the rest of the balance of that month, the other 3 weeks of that month, the only worms populating your pasture are actually ones that have survived a drench as well. So you can see even without the extreme of no refugia, even in our normal lamb drenching systems, there's actually not, if it's just lambs going round and round on their own little area, there's actually very little refugia there, and refugia being worms that you haven't screened with a drench. So they're worms that have been picked up off the pasture, developed in the animal, no drench has been applied, and they're just a mixed population of worms that aren't necessarily drench resistant. Did that answer the question enough in terms of what refugia is, or do you hear other things where people are confused about what it is?
No, I think generally people either understand it or they potentially don't want to. They don't care. Yeah. They just need to know what to do. Like, okay, yeah, I don't want to know the wizardry. I just want to know how it works.
Because the other thing about refugia is it's not just worm larvae on pasture. You know, the non-drench resistant worms have actually got to be able to breed with each other and produce eggs. So that's where that last 7 days in your 28-day period is supposed to give you a bit of time for that, but it's still not very long. So, you know, in terms of refugia in practice and what can you do, the piece of work that was done at Flock House back from the late 90s to the early 2000s, which was Dave Lethwick's classic piece of work where he compared different systems of ewe and lamb drench management and compared over the years how quickly the resistance status measured by reduction test changed over that period. So those were farmlets that were set up with sheep only, ewes and lambs. They had a known amount of or a known sort of level of resistance on those farmlets, and then they watched over time how quickly things developed. So the system where resistance developed the slowest was the system where the ewes and the lambs shared the same grazing area over the same, not necessarily ewes in paddocks with lambs at the same time, but over the months of summer and the months of autumn, they shared that grazing area. with undrenched ewes. So the undrenched ewes are the ones that are able to provide enough of those unselected, non-drench resistant worms back into the system all the time to dilute out the 3 weeks of every 4 where the resistant worms are coming out of the lambs. That's the easiest and simplest way of doing it. In specialist finishing systems where there might not be a lot of ewes or enough ewes, that may be more difficult, but there's solutions there too, right, in terms of hoggets that have weaned a lamb, like two-tooths, farmers who've taken this up in terms of putting these adult or teenage sheep in with lamb mobs always comment on how well they pick up without a drench, just giving them much, much better feed. So any system where you can integrate undrenched adult sheep in amongst that lamb system is going to provide you with good refugia. All the other systems that Dave and his team compared, i.e. ewes getting capsules, ewes getting a docking drench, those were the main ones. All of those developed resistance at a much faster rate, particularly the capsule one, than the one with undrenched ewes in the system. So those ewes have got to be genuinely undrenched to provide good refugia. So that's a breeding and finishing system. If you're finishing only, then it's leaving, again, it comes back to that principle. What's the easiest way on my farm to leave enough untreated animals in the system to provide some unselected worms back into the system all the time? Again, Ag Research have done work on this. They compared 10% lambs undrenched versus 20% lambs undrenched. Those are high numbers of undrenched lambs, especially over the summer. In winter, no problem at all. But I would suggest that for most people, leaving those percentages of lambs undrenched over the summer would be somewhat scary, especially in Barber's Pole areas, and I do sympathise with that. And so, if you're doing monthly drenching and leaving the heaviest ones undrenched like that through the summer, there's, some animals are going to go 8 weeks between drenches, and if there is a bit of Barber's Pole about, I can understand how that can be knocking animals around, unless they're on really, really clean feed. The other option is extending drench intervals. So that's, our lambs go onto that cleaner area. We can talk about how you manage that in a minute, but, when they come due for their drench, rather than just drenching them at 28 days, take your fecal egg count then, look at what it is. If it's shot right up, well, damn, we have to drench them. But more often than not on these, cleaner crops or areas of grass that you've prepared by grazing cattle for long periods, those sorts of cleaner areas, you're going to be able to stretch your drench intervals out. And that's another way of providing refugia, because you're just giving more weeks where the worms that are coming through are worms that haven't necessarily survived a drench.
So how can someone practice refugia effectively if they don't know whether their drench is working, or they don't have any idea of the parasite burden in their animals? Like, there's got to be a few steps involved before you can, because I know that there's a lot of people that a gate will come open in the yards and the drenched ones will get mixed up with the undrenched ones, and they go, oh, well, that's my refugia in place, done, or they'll miss a few up the race. But if they have no idea of what drenches are working, or even what their burden is to start with, does that
particularly the what drenches are working, like that's a really, really important point, because if your drench is ineffective and leaving a lot of worms behind in the first place, then to effectively dilute out that larger number of worms that are surviving, you actually need to leave more animals undrenched. And I can't remember the figures, but I know I've seen those calculations done. And the higher that your level of drench resistance goes up, the more you have to leave untreated, up to sort of 30, 40, 50% of a mob to get enough dilution. And so the other problem with that...
But if your drench is not working that well, then your animals are going to have quite high egg counts at that point, potentially, and then you're not drenching some, and would it start going backwards?
Yeah,
Can
and
it
the
go
other problem
backwards?
is if you think you're going to know that your drench is working just by looking, you won't. And you can easily have, this, I'm sure from your own monitoring, you can have easily have 60-70% effective drenches where you drench the lambs and they look fine and you think you've done your job, but actually each time you're leaving 30 or 40% of worms behind, and that's been enough in that month for the lambs to get enough of a break and continue to grow, but then you've left those worms behind. And that's where we've seen these cases in the last few years of the wheels falling off in March, April, May, as those numbers of worms build up. So, for me, the easiest way to provide refugia is, one, have as few lambs as possible after weaning. And again, that's easy to say, but, that is a system thing where you can slowly change that. And then, somehow have ewes in the system because it's so much easier than trying to do the maths, because there's too much guessing when it comes to doing the maths. But back to your point, the third, I've got these 3 rules, right? One is your fat, well-fed mixed stage ewes that can act as vacuum cleaners. I haven't talked about vacuum cleaners. They're vacuum cleaners and refugia. And then you've got your lambs on clean feed. And the third most important thing is to use the most effective drench that you can. So that's where that drench testing comes in, to know that when you do drench your lambs, you're not leaving a truckload of worms behind that you don't know about.
So is leaving adult ewes undrenched enough of a parasite management plan? Like, what else should farmers be doing? And if they're like, I know that there's a lot of farmers out there that just I don't drench my adult stock. It's a rule. I don't do it. But there are times of the year when they need it. What do you suggest to the farmers?
Nah.
Don't do it.
No, I'm being a bit glib. I mean, there are plenty of ewe flocks, particularly in the northern part of the North Island, where things like facial eczema and worms are just a constant threat. Where the genetics of those animals now are such that literally the mixed stage ewe flock does not get drenched at all. And things like liver fluke, they can be a bit of a red herring. You need to watch how you diagnose that. I do see flocks around where they'll do a liver fluke treatment, whether or not it's actually necessary. What else was I going to say about that? But things, a lot of those are diseases of pressure. So a well-fed mixed stage ewe flock of crossbred genetics, I'm not saying this is necessarily possible for merinos, should be able to get by with no drenching of the mixed stage ewe flock. But it's a farm system thing. If you're finding that you're having to drench your mixed stage ewe flock on a regular basis or even on an annual basis, there's probably stuff you can look at in your farm system.
Yeah. So again, there is an element of, like, there isn't really, and I think this is probably part of the whole confusion thing for parasite management, is that there's not necessarily one size fits all. You can't just say, we're going to do this here, we're going to do that there, we're going to do this here, because it doesn't necessarily work like that. Have you got?
Yeah, and people would much prefer recipes, and I totally get it, because farming's so complex anyway. Like, you've got all these other things to deal with, and then you've got people like me coming along going, oh, we actually need to think about parasite management rather than just do something by the calendar. And so it does just add another level, but keep coming back to that feeding thing of the ewe flock, and once you get that sorted, it is. Yeah, but then you've got to look at those lambs that are left behind. How are you growing them out, and what can you do to
I did see a quote of yours.
Provide them with as clean a feed as you can in your system.
I did see a quote of yours at the one of the Wormwise workshops that I went to. Something about getting the lambs off farm as quickly as possible. There was something. They have a quote of yours that they put across the screen.
Oh.
Something like, get the little bastards off the farm as quickly as you can. I think was,
it might be little worm taxis. Yep.
Yeah. So have you got any top tips for farmers or people in the industry as to how they can apply pressure to the wound of drench resistance on their property? Like, there is more resistance out there now. We're finding more and more resistance, as you know. what can they do when they've got, because we all hear about don't get resistance, it's really bad, you shouldn't get resistance, but there's a lot of people that are already faced with that. So what do they do?
Yeah, I mean, I've got neat examples of clients of my own who have still got triple drench resistance, but have got to a point where there's no adult stock treated. Lambs are, for a couple of years when we diagnosed that triple resistance, we did have to use a lot of Zolvix and StarTect in those systems just to clean things up while we sorted out the farm system. And they're into a sort of a system now where there's a bit of mixed use of drenches, if you like. We'll try and start the season with something fairly strong, and then they might be able to drop back into one or two less effective drenches and then clean up again at the end. But I would make the point that, this is all still territory that, all of us are navigating, but I do get to talk to experienced sheep vets around the country who are all sort of vaguely doing the same thing, and it does seem to be working. But, some things if you don't know your resistance status, it might not matter. If you're running a really low risk system, it might not actually matter whether you've got drench resistance. There are some finishing farms where lambs literally come on and get a quarantine drench, and maybe 20% of the lambs then get a further drench at some point while they're on the farm, but 80% of the lambs aren't getting another drench because the feed is so good. They're good managers of stock, and they grow those lambs as fast as they can, and they're out and gone. So a system like that, even though they've probably got some fairly gnarly drench resistance being finishers, and maybe had generated some resistance prior to getting a decent quarantine protocol in place. If you've got a low risk system, it almost doesn't matter. And same with these highly productive breeding flocks where, they are killing high numbers of lambs early. If you've only got your ewe lambs and a small cut of male lambs left after, say, January, February, the whole thing, the risk just drops right out of it. So while we always say you must know your resistance status, maybe that doesn't necessarily mean you have to do a full fecal egg count reduction test the first year. That's the gold standard. If you can get out there and do your whole fecal egg count reduction test and know the efficacy of the different drench families, then you've got a really, really good basis for knowing what combinations you can or should be using, where you're at on that sliding slope, and then make some good calls around things like knockout drenching and, within your system to protect what you've already got. But yeah, there are systems out there that are so low risk that it doesn't matter. And then there are others that are going to end up in the shit if they don't find out what's going on and make some changes. And I guess there's a whole spectrum between those.
So you talked about quarantine drenching. So I do want to ask you about quarantine drenching, because gone are the days where a triple drench is going to be your quarantine drench. So
long gone. Yeah.
Yeah. So what is the gold standard for quarantine drenching now?
Yeah, if you're in Australia and you look up Wormboss, which is their equivalent of Wormwise, it's had a much more detailed web resource around for much longer than what Wormwise has. Their gold standard now is that a effective quarantine treatment should be one of the novel drenches, i.e. Zolvix or StarTect, and then a BZ levamisole combination, so a Corporal or an Arrest or a Scander or whatever's still on the market, so that you've actually created a four-way combination. So there are some finishers out there who will use that protocol. There are others who will just use a novel drench, i.e. a Zolvix or a StarTect, and chances are that will be fine. Trevor Cook has just done a big monitoring project that he's wrapped up on a big finishing farm in the Manawatu, where they did lots and lots of fecal egg count monitoring of lambs over a 12 or 18 month period. And one of the things he found there was on that farm they were using, I believe, Zolvix as the quarantine drench, and they checked that every time after it was given and didn't find any leakage of worms through that treatment, which is awesome because when you look at the lab data, the Gribbles reports, and I don't know what your data says, but there are low, maybe 6-7% of tests or something in the Gribbles data showing up resistance to those novels. Do you guys have info on that?
We do. There's spots of, and it all obviously depends on what the farmer's been using on their property. If they've been using Zolvix, then the chances of there being Zolvix resistance on that property are obviously higher, because the more you subject an animal to the parasite to the drug, you've got the chance of it. But so it's minimal, but it's there.
That's right. So that's a perfect summary of why the four-way, and that there is some risk of importing a worm that is already resistant to Zolvix or StarTech. Look, the other thing we do see in practice, and the vets on the call will probably have seen this as well, where when you end up in a situation where you've got lambs that are actually sick and unwell with triple-resistant parasites, there can be times where you treat them with a Zolvix or a StarTech, and that's the first time you've ever used it on the farm, and it still appears to be leaking when you check it afterwards. And then when you come back around the next season and check those drugs, they seem to be working fine. So there's something about these sick parasitized lambs where probably the drug isn't being metabolized well, and there are published papers describing this elsewhere as well, lambs that are genuinely sick and parasitized with these horrible resistant worms, sometimes those novel drenches, the first time they're given, seem to not give them a proper clean out, but that situation doesn't seem to persist. Touch wood. I haven't seen any cases where it's persisted where that, where the drench has never been used on the farm and immediately you've got resistance. I've never seen that, but I have seen those cases where it's a bit scary to start with.
Yep. So when you talk about the quarantine drenches and giving them the 4 actives, you're talking about a StarTech or a Zolvix, and then another drench with a Scanda or a Restore. The benzodiazepine. So I've drenching everything twice.
I've got a photo of one of my friends who buys in lambs with a gun in each hand with thank you across the photo. I hate you. Why did you make me do this? And I know in Thai Happy they've developed a double barrel drench gun for the same purpose, where to give a 4-way combination with one shot. Local engineering firm there did that. So there are people out there trying to find ways around that. The other thing, though, just moving on from the quarantine drench, is that it needs to be a quarantine protocol, because one of the things we always emphasise in Wormwise workshops, right, is how long it takes eggs to pass out of the animal's gut, because the worm is in the animal's gut somewhere, either in the stomach or the intestine, and it lays eggs there, and then those eggs have got to pass all the way through the long curly intestine and come out and drop on your ground. So that process, the bulk of them are probably out within 48 hours. Never going to suggest to somebody buying in lambs to hold animals off feed for 48 hours, because 24 is enough of a challenge, but 24 is a compromise. Like the vast bulk of them probably are out by 24 hours. The point of a quarantine stand down like that is that until your novel drench kicks in and kills the adult worms and the developing larvae in the gut, those drenches aren't what we call ovicidal, so they don't kill eggs. So those eggs are still viable. So it's important that those eggs drop out somewhere where they're not going to develop on your farm. So ideally that's a bare yard where there's no grass for those eggs to hatch and develop into larvae on.
But at least you know where they are. Like, as long as you can kind of contain them and you know where they're being dropped out, is better than drenching them and then opening gates out the back of the yards and letting them wander all over the farm and away they go.
100%. So I've got a client who's got a bull block where lambs go down to finish, and then he's got a hill block. They know that they've got reasonable drench resistance on the hill block, so they just choose one paddock each year where they do their Zolvix. The lambs come down off the hills, or StarTech, whichever it is that year, down off the hills into that one paddock, sort of hang around there. They've got something to eat, got plenty of water, and then that paddock never has another sheep in it for 12 months and it only has bulls in it. And that's not perfect, but it's still better than not doing it. And these, you know, these rules that we give people about things like quarantine, I'd still rather you went halfway and kind of did it than just go, oh, this is too hard and not do it at all. And then after you've done your stand down, whatever that looks like, then those animals go out onto an area of the farm where there's already a mixed population of sheep worms, not onto your new maize ground that you've just regrassed if you can help it. Yeah.
Yeah, cool. Right, so I'll get people to pop in some questions so that we can answer. And while they're doing that, I wanted to play a quick game of word association with you, just to finish off, doing it with each of my guests, just to...
oh, Lord.
So I'm going to say a word, and I want you to answer with the first word that comes into your head as quickly as possible without as much thought as you can, okay? So if I say cat, you say...
dog.
Okay, good. Right, we're off to a flyer.
Okay, right. I've never done this before. I should have prepared myself.
This is fun. This is let's call it fun. Okay, let's start off. All Blacks.
Rugby.
Government.
Act.
Refugia.
Use.
Pet testing.
Pick pack.
Farmers.
Oh, awesome. I love farmers.
Awesome. Okay, so anyone out there got any questions? We've done that. Yep, there's no right or wrong answers, obviously, Ginny. I did start that. Oh, yes. So with mixing drenches, is there it's gone away.
Yeah, I saw that. And that's a fair comment.
Concern,
and I nearly said
myself
it.
With the
yeah, I nearly said it. So there is some certainly you shouldn't mix drenches together in a backpack. The combination drenches themselves are difficult enough to make and keep stable as they are without you putting further chemicals into the combination, or things like Healthy U or LSD shouldn't really go with your drenches either. I remember when Triton, which was the original triple combination, was first released, and I went to the launch of that, and they gave us all the background about how difficult it had been to formulate, because from memory, and I'm probably going to get it wrong, but like levamisole likes to be in an acid, and the mectins like to be sort of oily or something, and then BZs are a suspension, for instance, and they're all got completely different chemical properties. So it took them a really long time to be able to make a formulation where those drugs didn't break down. And so, mixing anything else together with them is a risk. And they're, so giving them down the throat at the same time, potentially, that risk exists as well. But I guess the attitude that's been taken by people who've made those double drench guns is we would still rather people use the most highly effective drench they can. And if they're not going to do it because it's too hard, we'd rather give them a way of doing it. That's one way of looking at it. I'm not sure I'm necessarily 100% in agreement with that.
I know that there's a lot of people who, when they're giving a novel active, notice that there's animals coughing, and they're a little bit like giving a teenager a shot of whiskey. They kind of go. StarTect
in particular, I remember using StarTect in reduction tests, and every single animal coughs. Yeah.
Yeah.
They don't necessarily spit it back, but they cough.
Yeah. Like the strong. Question: what's after Zolvix?
That's a good question, and it's one I get in every single Wormwise workshop. It's like, oh, well, you guys told us that there were going to be no new drenches coming along, 20 years ago, and then all of a sudden we got Zolvix and StarTect. Who's to know that we aren't going to get something else? We might. It is unlikely. We're more likely to get new fly or lice products because any new products are likely to come out of the development of companion animal products, because that's where the money is, folks. Like sheep is such a small category internationally anyway, and New Zealand sheep farming systems with the need for anthelmintic inputs, and probably like Ireland, Scotland, and a couple of other countries, it's such a small category globally for these big companies. And you do need a lot of money to develop new chemicals. So the
reality is that even if there was a new one that came out, we'd have to it's not going to save the world. Like if a new active came out, we're going to go down the same path.
Yeah,
anyway,
and the
so
concerning,
change.
yeah, if you look at a timeline of anthelmintic development and release, we probably went a good 30 years with BZs. We did before we started actually seeing resistance. Like they measured resistance to BZs in the early 80s, and they came on the market in the early 60s. So that was 20 years, but no one saw any clinical problems with it. And then levamisole, same, probably got a good 20 years out of that. We then got about 10 years out of the mectins before we started seeing resistance to them. With Zolvix and StarTect, it's only been 2 to 4 years on some properties where they've been used indiscriminately, where the worms have then developed resistance to those drugs. So it does seem that these highly resistant strains of worms have somehow become quite good at pumping out almost whatever you throw at them. The other thing about Zolvix is that the receptor, I'm going to get this wrong, but the receptor that Zolvix acts on is pretty similar to the one that levamisole acts on. So if you're indiscriminately using levamisole in the face of a bit of Zolvix use as well, you might not be helping your Zolvix along very well. So, there are a whole lot of things that we don't necessarily know about the genetic background of inheritance of resistance for these things. And it also seems that these highly drug-resistant strains can develop resistance a lot faster. So, as Tracy says, even if we get a new drug, chances are it's not going to hang around long being effective. There is one maybe bright spark on the horizon with different things that can potentiate drugs and make them more effective. There's a bit of work going on with technology that might bump up the efficacy of failing drugs for a period of time, in a way that, like, it's the way that the drug's delivered into the cell. But again, sheep anthelmintics are such a small category globally. For a company who's developing a technology like that, where, you want to make a cancer drug more effective, or you want to make, I don't know, anything more effective, like sheep are way, way down the list. So I think we've got to stop thinking that there'll be another silver bullet.
Yeah. So another question is, should you alternate novel drench year on year for quarantine drenches?
Maybe not so much for quarantine, because the thing about your quarantine drench is you're trying to prevent what's coming in your gate. So it's nothing you've done on your farm. So I'm not so sure about that, but I think that does apply where you are if you're in a situation where you need to be using novels on your own farm. And everybody, even if you've got no or minimal resistance, and you've got lambs on the farm for 5 drenches, 6 drenches, 7 drenches, whatever you do, doing that knockout treatment sometime in the autumn to knock out any small level of worms that have been surviving each of your routine drenches. That knockout, a lot of the time, by the time you do that treatment, your worm population might have become quite dominated by Trichostrongylis. So to me, this isn't necessarily a Wormwise recommendation, but it is something I recommend to my own clients, is if most of the time we're knocking out trichs at that time of the year, it doesn't make sense every year to expose your trichs to the same drug. So we will do a Zolvix one autumn and a StarTech the next to avoid that, where the trichs are always getting exposed to Zolvix, for instance.
So I have a quick question about knockout drenches. A Zolvix or a StarTech as a knockout drench, what is the difference between that and any of the other actives working at 100%? If you know that your levamisole abamectin combination is working at 100%, can you use that as your knockout drench?
Yes, you can, if the efficacy of each of those individual actives is high. If it's not, if the efficacy of those individual actives when you've tested them is, say, anything less than 90%, then, if you went back and redid that test the next day, it might be 70 or it might be 80. There is that much variability in the results. And so knowing, that the individual efficacy of those actives is quite important. If you've got a 95% effective levamisole and a 98% effective abamectin, and you use two of those as a knockout, probably don't have a problem with that. But if you've used levamisole and abamectin in a triple or whatever all the way through, you're actually not changing anything. No. And if you've used levamisole and BZ as your other drench, and then you use that, well, you're still sort of, using levamisole. But then again, that's the same with Solvix and StarTech, right? They've still got abamectin in them, but that's really just been there to protect the other actives, which, on some farms, you're really just using Dequantil or Monipantil because abamectin's failing already anyway.
Yeah, so one of the things that came up last week when we were talking to Greg Myrams is he was concerned, his concern is that the amount of reliance that the industry has on abamectin holding everything up at the moment.
Oh, God, yeah. Everything's got fish and cattle. My God, everything's got some sort of mectin in it, hasn't it? Apart from those early drenches of calves. So, you could say that about all of them. Yeah, I mean, in the end, we're not going to drench our way out of this, and we do, however we manage to do it, we do need to reduce the number of drenches that we're giving on our farms every year. It's as simple as that.
Yeah, and one of the things that I always say is, when we're talking about reducing drench use, it's not that we're anti-drench.
No,
and I use we're in the drench protection program. That's what we're doing at the moment. So
yeah. Because we want to use them
drench because we don't like chemical necessarily.
Yep. Oh, no.
Protect it.
Yeah, that's right.
So
we want it to be effective when we need it to be. We want to be able to treat our lambs with something that's going to be highly effective and not create a whole lot of pasture contamination. Because, that's the other thing. Most of these farms, by the time we diagnose drench resistance as a clinical entity, i.e. you've got sick lambs, like the system's actually drowning in worms because you've been leaving worms behind with these routine drenches for such a long time without realizing it, that you've actually, year on year, the contamination on your farm's gone up, or on that block has gone up and up without you realizing it. And then it's a really hard thing to unwind out of, particularly if you don't have a lot of flexibility with other stock classes and that sort of thing. So I do sympathise with people who've ended up in that situation, particularly if they're sheep dominant, and those young cattle systems that are all young cattle. I see awesome examples of those where the worm challenge is extremely low, and then I see others where they're just a sea of worms, and it's they can be so different.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we've almost hit our target time. So what I'll do is I'll make sure that there's no other questions out there, and I think we can safely say that we have we navigated our way through some of the questions and hopefully answered some. But thank you very, very much. Thank you for your time, and thank you for sharing your experiences with us. We have got another It's Monday on the 15th of January, when everyone doesn't want to leave their holidays, want to come back and listen to a webinar on parasite management. We've got veterinary parasitologist Dr. Frank Turnbull from Scotland, and he's going to talk about what's happening on that side of the world in terms of drench resistance, in terms of parasite management challenges that they're facing, how they're similar and how they're dissimilar, and what we can learn from each other, perhaps. So keep an eye out for registering for that. And thank you very much again, Ginny.